In this episode, we start by turning the PCI ISA blueprint into something you can actually use, not something you dread opening and then closing again. A blueprint is like the map the test writers used when they built the exam, so it quietly tells you what matters most and what is unlikely to show up in a big way. The trick is learning to read it like a set of promises about what you will be asked to do, not like a random list of security topics. Once you can translate each blueprint line into a simple learning target you can explain out loud, the whole study process becomes calmer and more predictable because you stop guessing and start preparing with purpose. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first idea to lock in is what a blueprint really is and what it is not, because beginners often confuse it with a textbook table of contents. A blueprint does not try to teach you, and it does not attempt to cover every interesting thing about payment security, so it can feel thin or oddly phrased at first. It is closer to a contract between you and the exam, where the exam is saying, these are the skill areas we will measure, and this is the depth we expect. That means you should treat every line as a clue about the kind of thinking you must practice, like identifying scope, explaining control intent, or reasoning about risk, rather than memorizing long lists of facts. When you read it this way, you stop asking what chapter is this from and start asking what would a correct answer look like if they asked me to apply this concept. Blueprints usually organize content into domains, tasks, or objectives, and beginners sometimes overlook how those words signal different types of expectations. A domain is a big bucket, like network security or access control, that tells you the general neighborhood of knowledge you should be able to navigate. An objective or task is more specific, often written with action words that suggest what you should be able to do with that knowledge, such as identify, explain, validate, assess, or document. Those action words matter because they hint at how the exam will test you, and they also tell you what kind of practice is worthwhile. If the blueprint says validate or assess, that usually points to reasoning and judgment, where you must decide whether something is sufficient rather than just recalling definitions. Another important skill is learning to recognize how the blueprint quietly describes the exam's balance between concepts and application. Some topics are knowledge-heavy, like understanding what certain security controls are meant to accomplish, and other topics are decision-heavy, like determining whether something is in scope or whether a control approach is acceptable. Beginners often make the mistake of turning everything into memorization, because memorization feels like progress even when it is not. The blueprint helps you avoid that by showing where the exam expects you to think like someone evaluating a situation. When you notice a blueprint line that sounds like a decision, your study target should become a habit of explanation, where you can say what you would look for and why, using plain language. Because the ISA certification sits in the payment security world, the blueprint will strongly emphasize scoping, data flows, and control intent, and those themes tend to repeat even when the words look different. New learners sometimes treat each line as a separate island, but the exam often tests connections, like how a scoping decision changes the controls you must consider. A blueprint line about network segmentation is not just about networks, because it also affects what systems are considered part of the cardholder data environment, CDE. A blueprint line about service providers is not just about contracts, because shared responsibility affects what evidence you need and what risks remain. When you read the blueprint, you should constantly ask how this topic changes the boundary of what is protected, who is responsible, and what proof would demonstrate that protection. A practical way to read a blueprint is to translate each line into a simple question you could answer in a short spoken explanation, because audio-style thinking exposes gaps faster than silent reading. For example, instead of saying I studied scope, you should be able to say what scope means, what makes something in scope, and what common mistakes make scope too big or too small. Instead of saying I studied segmentation, you should be able to say what segmentation is trying to achieve, what would convince you it works, and what would make you doubt it. This approach is not about creating scripts to memorize, but about building confidence that you can explain the idea clearly in your own words. If you cannot explain it, you do not own it yet, and the blueprint is telling you to keep working until you do. Another key move is to use the blueprint to build a small set of personal definitions that are consistent and exam-friendly. Beginners often pick up multiple overlapping definitions from different sources, then get confused when a question seems to assume a particular meaning. The blueprint helps because it anchors you to the exam's language, even if it is a little formal or abstract. When you see terms like scope, evidence, assessment, control objective, or risk analysis, treat them as vocabulary you must use with precision. Precision does not mean using fancy words. It means using the same meaning every time, so you can reason cleanly when the exam tries to distract you with similar but not identical ideas. You also want to pay attention to weightings or emphasis indicators if they are present, because they tell you where to spend your time for the biggest payoff. Beginners sometimes feel guilty focusing on high-weight areas, as if they are skipping important material, but a blueprint is literally telling you what is most likely to appear. If a domain is heavily weighted, it means you should not just understand it. You should be comfortable enough to handle tricky wording and close answer choices. If a domain is lightly weighted, you still need competence, but you can aim for clean understanding rather than deep nuance. Studying with weights is not gaming the exam. It is respecting the map you were given. When you review the blueprint, you should also look for topics that sound similar but are actually different, because these are common places where exams test understanding. For instance, identifying cardholder data is not the same as mapping payment flows, even though the two connect tightly. Protecting data at rest is not the same as encrypting data in transit, even though both involve confidentiality. Least privilege is not the same as multi-factor authentication, even though both relate to access control. The blueprint often places these as separate objectives to make sure you can keep them distinct while still understanding how they support each other. A strong blueprint reader learns to separate terms cleanly and then reconnect them in a bigger picture. A common beginner misconception is thinking the blueprint is a checklist you can complete once, like reading each line and moving on. Instead, you should expect to cycle through it multiple times, with each pass getting deeper and faster. The first pass is about understanding what each line means in plain language, without trying to master it yet. The second pass is about identifying which lines you cannot explain comfortably, and those become your priority targets. The third pass is about practice, where you can handle variations in edge cases, like what happens when responsibility is shared or when scope boundaries are fuzzy. By the time you finish those passes, the blueprint stops looking like a wall of words and starts feeling like a familiar route you have walked before. It also helps to understand how blueprint lines can generate different question styles even when the topic is the same. A single objective might produce a definition question, a scenario-style reasoning question, or a best next step question that tests judgment. For example, a line about segmentation could lead to a question asking what segmentation achieves, another asking what evidence would support it, and another asking what risk exists if it fails. A line about service providers could lead to a question about responsibilities, about what to verify, or about how shared responsibility can create gaps. When you read the blueprint, imagine at least 2 different ways each line could be tested, because that keeps you from studying too narrowly. Another blueprint skill is learning to spot what is intentionally excluded or de-emphasized, so you do not waste hours on low-yield detail. Beginners often fall down rabbit holes because cybersecurity is full of interesting technologies and endless depth. The ISA exam is not asking you to become a network engineer, a cryptographer, and a policy lawyer all at once, even though it touches those areas. It is asking you to understand payment security concepts well enough to assess, validate, and communicate what matters for PCI compliance and risk. If a blueprint line is high-level, your study should be high-level too, focused on intent, outcomes, and reasoning rather than brand names or configuration knobs. Staying aligned with the blueprint is how you protect your study time from becoming a hobby project. Finally, you should use the blueprint as a confidence tool, not just a planning tool, by turning it into evidence that you are ready. Confidence is not a feeling you wait for. It is something you build by checking that you can meet each objective in a simple, repeatable way. One helpful method is to pretend you are teaching each blueprint line to a friend who knows computers, but not security, because teaching forces clarity and exposes confusion fast. If you can explain the objective, give a simple example, and point out one common mistake, You are building exam-ready understanding. When you do this across the blueprint, you stop fearing surprises because you know you have covered what the exam promised to measure. As you move forward in this series, the blueprint will keep acting like a compass, reminding you where each topic fits and why it matters in the payment security world. The more you practice translating objectives into plain language explanations and then into decision habits, the more natural the material will feel, even if you are brand new to cybersecurity. Treat the blueprint as your anchor whenever you feel overwhelmed, because it narrows your focus to what is actually testable and important. By the end of your study cycle, you should be able to look at any blueprint line and calmly say what it means, why it matters, what it connects to, and what a good answer would need to include, and that is what real confidence looks like.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.